In the final turbulent days of 2020, a foundational principle of American democracy faced an unprecedented stress test. The tradition of a peaceful transfer of power, long considered an unshakable cornerstone of the Republic, was under immense strain. The incumbent president had spent months questioning the integrity of the election, creating a climate of deep institutional anxiety. This uncertainty cast a long shadow over one specific institution, the United States Armed Forces. The sacred norm of military neutrality and its subordination to civilian leadership was being tested, raising profound questions about the stability of the nation's most critical power structures. As an analyst focused on the mechanics of institutional resilience, my role here is not to offer an opinion, but to provide a clear technical breakdown of a critical event that unfolded during this period. We will examine the legal frameworks, the institutional culture, and the real-world consequences of a moment when the guardians of a national security institution took a public stand. Our objective is to understand how the system operated under extreme pressure, what lines were drawn, and why those actions were so significant. This is a story about the structures that underpin governance when they are pushed to their absolute limits. The pivotal event occurred on January 3, 2021. In an extraordinary break from protocol, all 10 living former Secretaries of Defense published a joint op-ed in the Washington Post. The signatories were a bipartisan list of the nation's most senior defense leaders, including figures like Dick Cheney, James Mattis, Donald Rumsfeld, and Leon Panetta. Their message was direct and unambiguous. The election was over, and the time for questioning the results had passed. They issued a stark public warning against any attempt to involve the U.S. military in an election dispute, declaring such an act unconstitutional and illegal. This letter was not a simple act of political disagreement. It was an emergency institutional intervention designed to protect the very machinery of American democracy. The central thesis of our analysis is that this public declaration served as an institutional firewall. It was a preemptive defense of the apolitical nature of the military, activated by the very individuals who had previously been charged with upholding that principle. They were not just expressing a view. They were publicly invoking their shared understanding of constitutional duty to prevent a potential crisis from escalating into a full-blown institutional rupture. To fully grasp the gravity of this moment, we must deconstruct the event piece by piece. First, we will examine the legal and constitutional guardrails that define the military's role in American society, including the president's powers and the oath sworn by every officer. Second, we will dissect the institutional machinery of the Pentagon, explaining the chain of command and the culture that shaped the response of its active duty leadership. Finally, we will analyze the concrete, real-world impact of the letter, from its effect on the transfer of power to the precedent it set for future civil-military relations. This analysis is designed to provide a systemic understanding of a complex and historically significant event. To continue this detailed exploration and support our work in breaking down critical institutional moments, we encourage you to subscribe to this channel, like this video, and share your own analytical thoughts in the comments section below. Our examination begins with the foundational laws and unwritten norms that were at the very center of this constitutional stress test, rules that dictate the precise relationship between the military and the state it is sworn to defend. To understand the intervention by the former Secretaries of Defense, we must first examine the legal and constitutional architecture that governs the U.S. military. This framework is not a matter of suggestion or preference. It is a rigid system of laws and norms designed to subordinate immense power to democratic control. The core question is, what are these foundational rules, and how do they function under pressure? The answer begins with the nation's founding document, the U.S. Constitution, which establishes a clear civilian-led hierarchy, placing ultimate authority over the armed forces in the hands of elected officials, not generals. At the apex of this structure is the President of the United States, designated by Article 2 of the Constitution as the Commander-in-Chief. This role grants the president supreme operational command over the nation's military forces. However, this power is not absolute. It is explicitly bound by the laws enacted by Congress and the fundamental principles of the Constitution itself. The president directs the military, but the military's ultimate allegiance is not to the person holding the office, but to the legal framework of the republic. This distinction is the central pillar upon which American civil-military relations are built and sustained. This principle of higher loyalty is formalized in the oath of office, sworn by every commissioned officer. Unlike the oaths taken in many other nations, the U.S. military oath is not a pledge of fealty to an individual leader, a political party, or a specific government. Instead, officers swear to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. This creates a legal and moral obligation to refuse any order that is unlawful or unconstitutional. The letter from the former secretaries was a public reminder of this primary duty, reinforcing that their first allegiance was to the rule of law. The oath's focus on the Constitution serves as a critical check on potential overreach. It establishes a clear hierarchy of loyalties, where the foundational law of the land supersedes any directive from the chain of command, including the president. In the context of the 2020 election, this meant that any order to use the military to interfere in the electoral process would directly conflict with this sworn duty. The former secretaries were not introducing a new idea. They were invoking the most fundamental promise made by every military leader, signaling that this constitutional red line remained firmly in place. Beyond the Constitution and the oath, a specific federal law erects another formidable barrier, the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878. This statute explicitly forbids the use of the U.S. Army, and by extension the Air Force, for domestic law enforcement purposes, unless expressly authorized by Congress or the Constitution. Its historical purpose was to end the military's involvement in governing the southern states after Reconstruction, and to create a clear separation between military and civilian policing functions. This law makes it illegal for a president to unilaterally deploy troops on American soil, to seize ballot boxes or enforce a political outcome. The Posse Comitatus Act provides a powerful legal shield for military leaders against unlawful domestic deployment orders. While there are exceptions, such as the Insurrection Act, which allows the president to use troops to suppress a rebellion, its application to an election dispute is highly contentious and legally dubious. Any attempt to involve the military in overturning an election would almost certainly be challenged as a violation of this act. The former secretary's warning of grave professional and criminal consequences was a direct reference to the personal liability any official would face for breaking this specific, long-standing federal law. Complementing these formal legal structures is a powerful, unwritten norm, the tradition of political neutrality. For generations, the U.S. Armed Forces have cultivated a culture of being staunchly apolitical. This norm is considered essential for maintaining the trust of the American people, ensuring that the military serves the nation as a whole, not the political agenda of a particular administration. A military perceived as partisan could fracture national unity and undermine its own effectiveness. This tradition is a cornerstone of democratic stability, ensuring that power transfers peacefully, regardless of which party wins an election. The op-ed was, in essence, an emergency defense of this norm. By bringing together leaders who had served both Republican and Democratic presidents, the letter demonstrated that the principle of military neutrality was a shared bipartisan value. It was a signal to the active duty leadership, to the American public, and to the world that the guardians of this institution would not allow it to be co-opted for political purposes. The act of publishing the letter was itself a break from the norm of retired leaders remaining silent, but it was undertaken to protect the more fundamental norm of an apolitical military. Together, these four elements, the president's constitutional role as a limited commander-in-chief, the officer's oath to the Constitution, the legal restrictions of the Posse Comitatus Act, and the deep-seated norm of political neutrality, form a multi-layered system of guardrails. This system is designed to keep the military within its proper constitutional lane. The public letter from the 10 former defense secretaries was not an attack on an individual, but a powerful reaffirmation of this entire legal and normative framework. They were publicly tracing the lines that could not be crossed, preparing the institutional ground for the events that would follow. With the legal and constitutional guardrails established, our focus now shifts inward, to the operational heart of the American defense establishment, the Pentagon. Understanding the public letter requires understanding the institution it was designed to influence. How does this massive bureaucracy, with its rigid hierarchies and deep-seated traditions, actually function? The answer lies in its unique blend of civilian leadership and military expertise, a structure designed to translate political will into lawful action. This institutional machinery, with its specific roles and cultural norms, was the arena where the constitutional crisis would either be averted or realized. The primary mechanism for control is the chain of command, a hierarchical line of authority that flows directly from the president. As commander-in-chief, the president's directives are passed to a civilian leader, the Secretary of Defense, who then transmits them to the military commanders. This structure intentionally places a non-uniformed official between the president and the armed forces, ensuring civilian oversight is embedded at the highest level. A crucial tenet of this system is that all orders must be lawful. An order that violates the Constitution or federal statutes is, by definition, invalid, and the obligation to obey ceases. The Secretary of Defense serves as the critical gatekeeper in this process. This position is not merely a messenger for presidential directives. It is the president's principal defense advisor, responsible for managing the entire Department of Defense. A core function of the secretary is to ensure that the president's will is executed in a manner that is both legal and constitutional. This individual is the final civilian check before an order reaches the uniformed military, bearing the immense responsibility of filtering policy through the lens of law. The firing of Mark Esper and installation of a loyalist acting secretary amplified concerns about this role. Beneath the civilian leadership are the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a council comprising the most senior uniformed leaders from each military branch. It is a common misconception that the Joint Chiefs command troops. They do not. Their role is strictly advisory. They provide the President and the Secretary of Defense with their best military judgment on a range of strategic issues. They represent the collective voice and professional expertise of the uniformed services, but operational command flows around them, directly from the Secretary of Defense to the combatant commanders. Their power is in their influence and the weight of their experience. The letter from the 10 former secretaries acted as a powerful external signal to this internal structure. It was, as the premise indicates, a shot across the bow, aimed at the active duty leadership, particularly the acting Secretary of Defense and the Joint Chiefs. By publicly articulating the constitutional limits of military action, the former leaders provided immense top cover for their uniformed successors. This unified declaration from every living person who had previously held the top civilian post made it institutionally easier for the current leadership to resist any potentially unlawful orders, reinforcing their legal and moral duty. This dynamic must be viewed through the lens of the Pentagon's institutional culture, which is deeply rooted in contingency planning. The Department of Defense is an organization that perpetually games out worst-case scenarios, from global conflicts to domestic catastrophes. Its purpose is to be prepared for events that others might find unthinkable. In the volatile political climate of late 2020, the once theoretical scenario of a president refusing to facilitate a peaceful transition of power was becoming a plausible contingency. An institution built on preparedness would have been forced to consider its response to such an unprecedented crisis. The escalating challenges to the election results and speculation about the use of emergency powers would have triggered this planning instinct. The internal machinery of the Pentagon would have been quietly analyzing the legality and operational feasibility of potential scenarios, not as a political act, but as a core function of its institutional DNA. The letter from the former secretaries landed in an environment already acutely aware of the constitutional red lines. It served as a public validation of the internal assessments that were almost certainly taking place, confirming that the institution's guardians, past and present, were aligned. Therefore, the response to the letter was shaped by the interplay of formal structure and ingrained culture. The rigid chain of command, with its requirement for lawful orders, provided the formal mechanism for refusal. The advisory role of the Joint Chiefs provided a channel for unified military counsel against unconstitutional action. The culture of contingency planning ensured that the leadership was not caught unprepared by the unprecedented nature of the threat. The letter itself served as a powerful catalyst, activating these latent institutional defenses by making the private concerns of the defense establishment a matter of public record. Ultimately, this institutional machinery was designed to be a shock absorber, capable of upholding the rule of law even when under immense political pressure from the very top of the chain of command. The system relies on key individuals, the Secretary of Defense and the senior uniformed officers, to honor their oaths to the Constitution above any personal loyalty. The extraordinary intervention by the former secretaries was a deliberate effort to bolster the resolve of those individuals, reminding them and the nation that the institution's fundamental allegiance is to the constitutional order, not to any single administration. Having examined the legal guardrails and the institutional machinery of the Pentagon, we now arrive at the final, crucial question. What were the concrete, real-world consequences of this unprecedented public intervention? The letter from the 10 former secretaries of defense was not an academic exercise. It was a deliberate action designed to have an immediate and decisive effect. Its impact can be measured in how it directly influenced the transfer of power, the precedent it established for future crises, and the way it reshaped the public understanding of the very foundations of American civil-military relations. The most immediate impact was on the security and finality of the presidential transition. In the highly charged atmosphere of early January 2021, with speculation about the invocation of emergency powers rampant, the letter eliminated any ambiguity about where the U.S. military stood. It sent an unmistakable signal to the acting leadership within the Pentagon and to the entire chain of command that there was zero institutional support for any attempt to use military force to dispute the election. This public declaration effectively foreclosed that option, solidifying the transition process and ensuring the peaceful inauguration of the president-elect on January 20th. This institutional resolve was tested just 3 days after the letter's publication, when the U.S. Capitol was stormed on January 6th. In the chaotic aftermath of that event, the Joint Chiefs of Staff issued a rare internal memorandum to the entire armed forces. In that memo, they reaffirmed their sworn oath to the Constitution, condemned the violence, and explicitly acknowledged Joe Biden as the incoming president-elect. This act cemented the position articulated by the former secretaries, demonstrating that the active duty leadership was fully aligned with their predecessors and would not deviate from its constitutional obligations, even amidst a historic domestic crisis. The collective intervention by the former secretaries also created a powerful and complex new precedent. Never before had the entire living cohort of former Pentagon chiefs united to publicly warn a sitting president about crossing a constitutional line. This raises an ongoing and critical debate. Was this a necessary and courageous act to defend democracy from a unique threat? Or was it a dangerous step that risks politicizing revered national security figures? The event established a new playbook for institutional guardians, but the long-term consequences of its use remain a subject of intense analysis and discussion within defense and policy circles. At its core, the letter functioned as what the premise identifies as an institutional firewall. It demonstrated that even when subjected to intense political pressure from the highest level of civilian authority, the deep-seated norms and legal structures of the U.S. defense establishment held firm. The unified bipartisan front presented by leaders like Cheney, Panetta, Mattis, and Rumsfeld signaled a red line that could not be crossed without risking a complete rupture within the national security apparatus. This preemptive defense successfully contained a potential constitutional crisis before it could fully materialize, showcasing the system's underlying resilience. Beyond the immediate crisis, the op-ed profoundly affected the national conversation. It thrust the intricate and often obscure subject of civil-military relations into the center of public debate. Vulnerabilities in the system, which had previously been confined to academic journals and think tank reports, were suddenly exposed for all to see. The letter made the theoretical tangible, forcing a widespread reckoning with the fragility of democratic norms that many Americans had long taken for granted. It revealed that the principle of military neutrality is not self-executing. It requires constant reinforcement, particularly from those entrusted with its care. In synthesizing these outcomes, we return to the central thesis of our analysis. The op-ed from the 10 former defense secretaries was not a simple act of political dissent. It was an emergency institutional intervention, a deliberate and calculated move to protect the cornerstones of American democracy, the peaceful transfer of power, and the apolitical nature of the military. The signatories acted as the collective memory and conscience of the institution they once led, publicly invoking the legal and normative guardrails at the precise moment they faced their most severe test in modern history. The enduring structural consequence of this event is a newfound awareness that democratic norms, once believed to be unshakable, are in fact fragile and can be pushed to their breaking point. The episode demonstrated that their survival may depend on active, public, and extraordinary defenses from institutional actors. It showed that the unwritten rules of governance are only as strong as the willingness of leaders to uphold them, especially when it is difficult or professionally risky to do so. This realization has fundamentally altered the understanding of institutional stability and the responsibilities of its guardians. Ultimately, what was at stake in January 2021 was the continuity of the American democratic experiment itself, a system that hinges on the universal acceptance of election results and the absolute subordination of military power to civilian rule. The letter from the former secretaries was not about a clash of personalities, but about the resilience of a foundational institution in the face of an unprecedented constitutional stress test. The event serves as a critical case study, proving that the U.S. Armed Forces' allegiance to the Constitution remained paramount, preserving the integrity of the Republic during a moment of profound peril.